You never know what an incredible ancient artifact is going to look like until you see it. It could be large or small, soft or hard, thousands of years old, or just a few centuries. One incredible ancient artifact might have nothing in common with another one, except for the fact that they're incredible. Watch this video and you'll see exactly what we mean. They say that good things come in small packages, so we guess this discovery from February 2021 must be extra special. It's a set of lead miniatures that was found inside an Imperial-era grave in Alba-la-Romaine, France. The artifacts come from a set of 20 newly discovered graves that were found buried less than 2 feet beneath the surface of a busy crossroads. From the evidence available at the site, it looks like the people who are buried here passed away during the 1st and 2nd centuries. There were grave goods present in all of the graves when they were checked, but these lead miniatures are unlike anything archaeologists have ever seen before. One of them is a tiny pair of sandals hanging from a coat hook, and the other is a set of 4 strigils attached to a ring. The symbolism of the objects is unknown, but may have had something to do with whatever the owner's profession or hobbies were in life. The presence of a round masonry structure at the center of all the burials suggests that this is a family plot. It might be connected to the large Roman villa that was found barely 1,000 feet away from here back in 2005. We often lament the fact that even with all our modern medical knowledge, we still don't have a cure for the common cold. Perhaps we shouldn't. The Anglo-Saxon inhabitants of England believed they'd cured the common cold centuries ago, and they even left behind a medical textbook to explain how to do it. The book, which includes a helpful series of illustrations, is written in Latin and has the catchy title Cotton MS Vitellius C3. It's the only surviving example of a so-called Old English herbal book and was compiled by several 4th century doctors working in unison. Among its questionable cures and remedies is the suggestion that you can rid yourself of unwanted body odor by boiling artichokes in white wine and then eating them. Any form of mental distress can apparently be treated by drinking garlic juice, which has the added bonus of also taking care of female genital complaints. If you want to cure a cold, all you need to do is take cabbage, mix it with fennel, aged lard, and animal fat, and eat it. We're not sure about it curing your cold, but we guarantee the taste might take your mind off it for a while. For as long as humans have had the capacity to mold and shape clay, they've been creating representations of the female form. You'll find far more ancient world figurines of women than you will of men. Historians and archaeologists believe that the prevalence of statues might be connected to the veneration of motherhood and fertility. But it's impossible to be sure. As an example, check out this Paleolithic Venus figurine from Amiens in France. It's one of a number of similar figures that have been found in the same place in the past few years. This figurine was found in 2020, and it's the 15th since 2014. All of them are roughly 23,000 years old. As the figures lack arms, legs, and heads, you might be inclined to think that they're broken. Actually, this is their intended form. They were sculpted just as torsos, focusing on the parts of the female body associated with pregnancy and reproduction. Most historians think the figurines were used as fertility totems, but a smaller group think they may have been self-portraits created by women who had no access to mirrors and so had no idea what their faces looked like. We're not sure about that. Surely they'd be able to see themselves reflected in water. Anytime you take a shovel and start digging up the ground, you have a chance of finding something wonderful and ancient. We know of a Turkish farmer who found that out firsthand in November 2015. Hatice Surin was tending to his olive grove in the Bursa region of Turkey when his tool hit something hard, barely a foot underneath the surface. After carefully clearing up the area around it, Hatice realized quickly he'd come across an ornately decorated sarcophagus. He knew that it might be valuable, so he got in touch with the police. They confirmed that this wasn't a police matter, but they did arrange for archaeologists to attend the scene. After inspecting the casket, the experts concluded that it comes from towards the end of the Roman Empire's era, most likely the early 5th century. Excavating it wasn't an easy job because it weighs a little over 7 tons. It's lucky that the sarcophagus was still there to be found at all. After cleaning and inspecting it, museum staff noted marks on its surface that suggest treasure hunters tried and failed to break the sarcophagus open hundreds of years ago. It's now in safe hands. Being a leader was a dangerous occupation in the ancient world. Even if you weren't at war with your neighbors, you had to be on your guard against your own people rising up to overthrow you. Assassination was a constant risk, so rulers needed solutions. Goa stones were the most beautiful of those well-intended but ultimately useless solutions. Goa stones were actually gilded versions of bezoars, which become far less beautiful when you find out what they're made of. It's the hardened remains of whatever indigestible material one might find in the gastrointestinal tract of an animal with hooves. Ancient folklore and mysticism said that a bezoar could cure any poison. All you had to do was hold your nose and swallow it. Most of them are made of seeds, rock, calcium, hair, and fruit pits. Swallowing an entire bezoar would obviously be impractical. So instead, a leader might crush some up and eat it with their food, or drop the bezoar into a drink they suspect might have been poisoned. French surgeon Ambroise Paré proved beyond all reasonable doubt that bezoars couldn't cure anything in the 16th century. But despite that, they remained popular until well into the 17th. Whether you were interested in mathematics at school or not, you've learned about Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was hailed as a genius in his lifetime, and he was. But the famous theory that bears his name wasn't actually his. In fact, all of his concepts were familiar to the Babylonians more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was even born. We know that because of this 3,800-year-old clay disc in Yale's Babylonian collection. Experts think that the cuneiform tablet is the ancient equivalent of homework, and that the equations on it were etched by a child learning math. One of the sums calculates the square root of 2 to an impressive 6 decimal places. We don't know about you, but we know that we couldn't do that without the assistance of a calculator. Among the 45,000 artifacts in Yale's Babylonian collection, you'll also find Babylonian dictionaries, world lists, and attempts to preserve an even older, dying language for future generations. The civilization was centuries ahead of its time, and these formulas should be taught as Babylonian theorem in school. The Penn Museum in Pennsylvania, USA, knows a thing or two about ancient artifacts. That's why it was worth paying attention when, in April 2018, the institution announced that it was putting one of the most important sets of Middle Eastern artifacts in the world on display for the first time ever. The museum spent 3 years and $5 million on renovations just so the 1,200 artifacts in the collection could be exhibited. It's such a massive exhibition that it's hard to focus on a single piece. But the burial finery of Queen Puabi is well worth a look. She was a Mesopotamian ruler of about 4,450 years ago and was buried with a gold headdress, a cloak made of carnelian and agate beads, and a collection of elaborate jewelry that even the Queen of England might consider to be too ostentatious. Elsewhere, there's an elaborately decorated lyre that features a golden bull's head and a shell mosaic. It's believed to be one of the oldest surviving musical instruments in the world. In terms of importance, though, it's hard to look past the 4,000-year-old clay tablets that contain cuneiform symbols and markings. To some historians, these tablets demonstrate the invention of the written word. There's a tiny monk inside the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. He's barely over a foot tall. But if you choose the right day, you can go to the museum to see him walking around, beating his chest in prayer, raising his cross, and then clasping his hands together and bowing his head. His commitment to his acts of devotion is impressive when you consider that he's more than 400 years old. It's even more impressive when you find out he's just a clockwork automation. The figure, which is made of wood and iron, is an homage to San Diego de Alcala, a miracle worker and faith healer of the 16th century. The so-called miracle monk allegedly healed the son of Emperor Charles V, so the emperor had his personal technician, Juanello Turriano, build a robotic replica of him as a tribute. The story is especially poignant because the emperor's son was King Philip II, who would go on to marry Mary Tudor and install Catholicism throughout England. King Henry VIII's subsequent rejection of Catholicism was a critical factor in the Reformation movement. That's a lot of history to pin on a moving doll, but here it is. We've all heard the term African voodoo dolls before, and most of us associate them with wishing or even performing harmful acts on others. That's because African voodoo dolls are among the most misunderstood artifacts in the world. Rather than the versions of them you might see in horror films, here's a set of real ones. Instead of sticking pins in them to injure someone or make them sick, these dolls were used in love spells to conjure healing or protection, or consulted for spiritual guidance. It's true that wrapping a piece of hair or cloth to it was thought to connect the doll to whichever person the hair or cloth once belonged to. But any item attached to the voodoo doll was more likely to be taken from someone dead than someone living. By attaching the hair of a dead loved one to a voodoo doll, people felt they could maintain a connection to them. A voodoo doll, or bochio to give it its proper name, was never a representation of a real living person. The doll was merely a messenger through which the owner or whatever attachments it wore might be contacted. There might have been attempts to use bochio to harm people, but such attempts were few and far between. They were certainly never the norm. The only people you expect to see wearing a crown are members of a royal family, and even then it's usually only the king or queen. Lesser members of the family might wear a tiara instead or something equally less elaborate. That wasn't always the case, though. Check out this Nepalese crown from 1717. It's more elaborate than the crowns of many European monarchies, and yet it didn't even belong to a king. Instead, it belonged to a Vairākara Buddhist priest. The name Vairākara is a caste name as well as a family name and belongs only to the highest-ranking members of Nepalese Buddhist society. Holding the name entitles an individual to perform specialized priestly functions and apparently wear incredibly ornate headgear. An inscription on the crown's interior tells us that it was commissioned by two devotees of a Vajrakarya priest so he could wear it to a special occasion that would involve the consecration of some new religious icons. The inscription includes a warning to whoever might consider stealing the crown, telling them that such a deed would remain auspicious for eternity. It's now in the collection of the Met Museum in New York. That's a pretty auspicious place, so maybe the curse worked. We could spend all day talking about the contents of the Met Museum. We won't do that, but let's get in another of their exhibits while we're here. It's an ivory unguent box, and it's thought to have belonged to Queen Nefertari of Egypt. The artifact is approximately 3,250 years old and is in fantastic condition. It's a lenticular box with a swivel lid, sitting on a cylindrical base. The box can be opened several ways using the tiny attachments on the sides, and its interior compartments can be rearranged by twisting it. Perched on the top is a tiny figurine of a hedgehog. The animal is represented by the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth to the ancient Egyptians, and the purpose of its inclusion on the artifact is unknown. The connection to Nefertari comes from the presence of her cartouche on the lid. The cartouche of her husband, Ramses II, is also present, but it's believed to have been Nefertari's on the grounds that it's thought to have been a makeup container. How the symbolism of the hedgehog would be relevant to a makeup container is unknown, so the explanation doesn't satisfy everybody. On the face of it, the Rokstone in Sweden is an ancient monument erected by a Viking father mourning the loss of his son. However, a more recent analysis of the runestone suggests that it might have another meaning. The artifact was created in the early 9th century when a Viking spent weeks chiseling a long message into the side of an 8-foot-tall, 5-ton granite block. This is, in fact, the longest runic inscription in the world. The author was a man named Varin, and the name of his son was Vamor. Aside from telling his son's tale, he also notes with some fear the events of recent years, which included a solar storm, an unusually cold summer, and a total eclipse of the sun. Varin took these as signs of the apocalypse, or to put it in Viking terms, the coming of the Ragnarok. Norse belief holds that when Ragnarok arrives, all human life on Earth will end. The runes show a remarkable understanding of events that happened centuries before Varin was born. He referenced a time of great trouble 9 generations earlier. 9 generations are enough to cover 300 years, which is when a series of enormous volcanic eruptions plunged Sweden into an extended cold spell that led to the death of around half of its population between the years 536 and 550. Varin feared the same events were happening again. We turned out to be wrong, but we can understand how a father who just lost his son would feel like the world is ending. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.